Leanne, tell me, how did you get started in this field of brain injury? What made you first get interested in it?
The first patient I saw who had a traumatic brain injury, I actually saw her while I was working in a stroke rehab unit. And up until that point, I'd been working with older people, mostly who had aphasia. And I didn't really know much about traumatic brain injury at all. But I had this girl was sent to me. I was in a district hospital in the western suburbs of Sydney, and she'd had a fall whilst standing in a queue, and she was exactly the same age as me. And just prior to her falling, and it was always very unclear whether she'd had a little stroke and then fell, but she certainly had a bleed, but she'd fallen on the left side of her head. And so she did have a global aphasia. She could not speak a word. 3 weeks prior to her having the injury, she'd got married, and she had this beautiful young husband. And anyway, she arrived, and in those days I could treat her as often as I wanted. So I booked her in for 5 sessions a week, and we did 5 hours every week, and then I gave her miles of practice to do with him, with the husband. And as often happens after traumatic brain injury, I now know the aphasia recovered quite well. And 12 months later, she was speaking in full sentences, and she really did make a very good recovery, but she still had these other problems that I wasn't as familiar with, which I now know were more cognitive communication problems. So being able to maintain topics in conversation, and her memory wasn't very good. So we needed to put strategies in place, and she eventually went back to work, and I helped her on the graded return to work thing without really knowing what I was doing. But anyway, we kind of got through that. And she went back to work, and she made as close to a full recovery as you could see. So by the end of that process, I really loved doing it. I loved working with somebody who I knew was going to go out and get back into her life, and she had a whole life ahead of her. And I related to her so much that I decided this was what I wanted to do. So I started to look for jobs that were with young head injury patients. So that was really the start of the journey. And then when I really started my first job, which was at Parramatta Hospital, as a very junior clinician, I was on an extremely steep learning curve, because that's when I really came in contact with all the different sorts of presentations you can see from traumatic brain injury. But I was hooked. I mean, I just loved it, and I couldn't think of anything else that I would want to do, and I still don't really.
So, who has influenced you most in your career, would you think? Got any thoughts about that?
Well, there's a number of people, I think. I think I've spoken about him many times, but Mark Ilvasaka has been a major influencer of how I think about, well, certainly how I thought about clinical work when I was working as a clinician, but then he really informed how I thought about my research, and making it as real world as possible, and thinking about the context of the person. And he had such amazing depth of thinking in terms of his ideas were drawn from so many different perspectives. You know, he came from a philosophy background, and he had Vygotsky theory, educational theories, and then he was just a really good clinician. So he just had a lot of common sense about him. I think another person who's had an incredible influence on me and my thinking is you. And because, you know, we obviously met when we were both clinicians at Lidcombe Hospital, and back then when I started at Lidcombe, I really didn't know what neuropsychologists did. And I remember reading neuropsychology reports in awe, thinking, oh my goodness, this is what neuropsychologists do. And just the synergies that could happen with speech pathology. So I think being in contact with you, Robin Tate, obviously, who was also there at the time, I mean, it was just such a power team to be exposed to, and to be around people who weren't just there to do a job, you know, that particular team, and people I now work with, it's not a 9 to 5 job and you just clock in and you see your 6 patients a day or your 10 patients a day, which is what we used to see, and then you go home and you don't think about it anymore. It was working with people who were really thinking about what they were doing and wanting to make things better, and you know, aspiring for the highest outcomes possible for the people they were working with.
Great, okay. Do you have any other research interests outside of traumatic brain injury?
Yes, I also work in the field of aphasia. So I work with a big community of practice of speech pathology researchers nationally and internationally, and their focus is more on stroke and the specific aphasias that we see after stroke. And so I've been very lucky to start to be involved in programs that are looking at how to improve treatment efficacy for people with aphasia. So there's a couple of projects I'm involved with at the moment. One is looking at comparing two fairly short-term but quite intensive treatments for people with aphasia after stroke. And then there's another project I'm involved with which is actually about preventing depression in people with aphasia by giving them a 6-week set of treatment sessions to look at what resources they have and building resilience and having some, you know, picture of where they're heading when they leave the hospital, because what we're finding with aphasia, people with aphasia, they get discharged very early and quite often there's not much there when they get out. So it's making them aware of what resources they can have available to them. And the other area that I've become interested in over recent years is e-health and the impact that technology is going to have on the way we deliver treatment. And so that has meant that there's been another whole group of research projects that I've been involved with that are looking at things like, can we use an iPad app to assess somebody with aphasia by distance? And so the student in Singapore has just finished her PhD where she developed this really cool app for an iPad that is multi-modality functionality, and it enables you to see the person on video. You've got a little whiteboard space you can write on. You can deliver assessment stimuli using the app, and the person just needs to use touchpad responses. So these advances are going to really change how we can provide services to not only rural and remote patients, but even people who live in big cities who may have difficulty with transport, or who may not want to go to the brain injury unit, or may not want to go to the hospital, and that it's much more normalising for them to be just working on an iPad at home. So I think e-health is a really interesting advance. We've got another student who's looking at Twitter and TBI, and we're thinking that Twitter may offer another avenue to develop social networks and to give people their identity back if they can engage with the Twitter community. So there's that. I think that's a very exciting, exciting advances.
Great. So what would you say is your biggest achievement in the work that you've been doing?
I think probably the biggest achievement is being able to have students who I can teach about assessment and research, and then have them go on and do great things. And so I really value my students. I value the wonderful intellect they bring and their energy, and I think I'm having students graduate who are now working overseas, and they're starting their own careers, and giving workshops, and you can just see the word being passed on. So it's that for me is I think one of my biggest achievements is how great my students are and what happens to them when they leave, when they graduate.
What do you think has made you successful throughout your career?
I think the most significant aspect of success is collaboration and finding people you like and finding people you respect, and being able to engage with lots of different ideas. I think that's certainly been part of my success, is being able to not just be sitting in a room on my own trying to think up bright thoughts. It's being in contact with many brilliant people who all bring their own perspective, and then working out from all of that what a good treatment might be or what a good assessment might be. And working with generous people and working with people that you trust. I think they're the key aspects to success.